Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. Welcome to the fourth season of Grid Connections, and today we have Steve Birkett, the founder of Plug and Play EV, returning, along with Walter Schulze joining us for the first time. Walter is the host of the Network Architect channel, where he hosts the EV Driver series. He shares timely updates on EV charging station providers and new locations they're adding across the country. Together, we'll all delve into some of the latest perceptions around EV sales numbers and explore maybe it's not all doom and gloom as the headlines would want you to believe. Then explore the challenges dealerships face in selling electric vehicles and examine the ongoing rollout of EV charging infrastructure across the country. Plus, we'll also discuss some of the tactics charge point operators use when discussing an EV fast charging location to meet various use cases. Being based in a more rural part of the West Coast, I really appreciate Steve and Walter for sharing their own recent experiences with driving their electric vehicles on the East Coast and some of the road trips into the Midwest they've taken. It's always fascinating to hear how the EV landscape varies across different regions. It seems like out of the three of us, I've had the most issues lately, but we all agree that overall it continues to be an overly positive and improving experience for all of us. As a reminder, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with at least one friend or colleague who would find it interesting as well. Don't forget to leave a positive review on our podcast page. Your support helps us reach more listeners and continue bringing you great content. With that, enjoy.
Walter, do you want to kick it off?
Certainly. My name is Walter Schulze, the owner and operator of the Network Architect Channel Studios, which is basically just my home office, really nothing much to it. I'm a technologist by profession for multiple decades and have become an EV enthusiast over the past several years and have been pursuing YouTube content creation probably for 18 months or so, and find it a way of pursuing an outlet for my passion for EVs. It's a lot of fun to engage with the social media community out there.
I'm Steve Birkett. I'm Plug and Play EV on YouTube. Been doing it since around 2018, 2019. Years seem to fly by, but started off in a Bolt EV back then, and it was much different landscape than it is now. I think we've talked about it, Chase, a little bit on the previous episode, just covering some of the content, cold weather charging, the very early stages of DC fast charging, and kind of grew from there. So eventually hooked up with a guy called Eric Way out on the West Coast in California, who's even older OG Bolt owner than myself, and Walter joined us as well for what we now have as a fortnightly podcast on EV charging and electric vehicle infrastructure called Coast to Coast EVs. So that's about where we are today.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you both for being on. I know Eric couldn't make it today, but we're hoping to have him on a future episode as well. And definitely recommend anyone who loves our content on Grid Connections. I think the show that you guys do perfectly aligns with kind of a lot of the similar topics, and really appreciate just kind of getting some of the context and some of the definitely, I don't want to say microcosms, but definitely some of the other areas that you guys really do focus on that personally I just don't think get enough attention. So I've always been a big fan of the show. But with that, I know one of the things that we kind of wanted to probably kick it off with is just, I think there's, it's really been the theme probably for the last 6 months, maybe even more, news around kind of the pullback in the EV space and EV charging. And I think some of that's finally starting to change, where people are realizing that it's more media headlines and hype than reality, and maybe, if anything, short-term struggles for a few players in the space, but everything is still kind of going in the right direction. So with that, I would kind of just love to kind of kick that off and just get your own thoughts about any areas that either of you are seeing maybe some slowdown, but the areas that you still remain optimistic for growth in electric vehicles in the space overall.
Yeah, nobody really told folks in my area that there was a slowdown, because I see more and more diverse range of EVs every day. Even Walter drives a Cadillac Lyric, as I'm sure we'll get onto. I'm seeing a lot more of those nowadays. So there's just the diversity locally. I'm just here north of Boston in Massachusetts, so obviously have that, coastal, slightly friendlier EV state perhaps than some of the others where people will focus the negativity. But I think if you look at the numbers and the general trends, although you can always pick out some individual month to month or year to year stats that kind of show an issue, not least, Tesla at the moment at the start of the year in Q1 is the one that's kind of down a little bit, but then you look to your Ford, Hyundai, Kia, even GM kind of potentially coming up with some of their new models. It starts to put the lie to that kind of EV sales are a lot of people try to make out dropping, but really it's kind of a slowdown in growth, which is kind of natural when you consider you're going from that early adopter phase where nobody had an EV to that kind of slightly more mature market where the growth is inevitably going to slow, but it isn't. It isn't cratering. It's not stopping. This is just kind of another little blip on the way to wider EV adoption.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. I don't know if there was anything else, Walter, you wanted to add to that, or any other things that maybe you've seen.
My personal opinion is we have the economics on our side. Fleet owners are adopting electric vehicles not because they're trying to save the planet, they're trying to improve their balance sheets. And when economics makes sense, there's the phrase, no army can withstand the force of an idea whose time has come. And I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that the economics around EVs just make sense for fleet owners and also household budgets. And when that's the case, when you can improve a quality of life and also decrease the expenditures for costs for transportation in the same swoop, it's very difficult to say that there's going to be a decrease in sales. In fact, I don't know anyone who has a forecast for EV sales that is predicting a downturn. There's two notable ones, Bloomberg and Cox Automotive, just in the past, I think, month, have both forecasted increased growth for EVs, and neither one of those are environmentally centric outlets. They're very pragmatic. Just today, I was watching Autoline Daily, and there was a report about Toyota, which makes arguably the worst EV in the market. And there's some question if they're trying to torpedo their own initiatives or whatever. But the BZ4X, the RZ Lexus, and the Subaru Solterra combined year to date are 17,000 units. And for the producer of perhaps the worst EV, those are pretty solid numbers. Back 5 years ago, 17,000 units year to date to June 1st would have been something to celebrate. And now these are just kind of like meh numbers. So I think the demand is there. And as I said, fleet owners are proceeding as if this whole enigma of lack of EV demand doesn't exist. Rideshare owner-operators are very heavy into EVs. And so I think when the economics make sense, there's really no stopping it.
Yeah, I think you just brought up a lot of great points on that one kind of conversation right there, Walter. What's really fascinating is you quoted not just Bloomberg, but also Cox Automotive. And I actually used to do some work with Autoline Daily. And one of the things we used to talk with are some of the people there at both Cox and Bloomberg. And what was so funny was you just wind the clock back maybe 2 or let alone like 3 years ago. And the numbers that they had for EV growth was like super, I guess you could just say pessimistic. And it seems like every quarter, a lot of these groups, even with maybe they've changed it a little bit, but it's like every year, and then you look at it quarterly, that number that they're predicting the future growth to be has actually increased. It's like, you go back a few years, like, we see this maybe being 20%. And now you go like 2 years back, I'm like, well, maybe we see it being 30%. I'm like, well, yeah, probably by 2030, it's going to be 40%. And so there's kind of this bizarre hindsight is 2020, obviously, but it is just really interesting to show that a lot of the people that I think have kind of pushed back on the narrative and said that there isn't a need, even the more conservative outlier kind of outlets out there have been slowly revamping their long-term numbers in a positive direction. And even though sometimes we'll be seeing the headlines from them like, oh, does this quarter sales mean that this trend is reversing? It really is all around the idea that the short-term noise doesn't really align with what we're seeing as kind of, excuse me, as a long-term signal in the space between buyers and interest in electric vehicles.
Yeah, as
You're
far
going to
as I
add
know,
something,
there's
Walter?
not a single prediction out there indicating a decrease in EV growth that I know of. There might be one out there, but I have not seen it. And I try to be objective in the outlets that I review, but it's going to increase. The only question is at what measure, and that's
Right.
really the art.
No, and I think that's a great clarifying point, because for a lot of them, I think what we have seen is, and this I've seen misreported, where maybe some of these outlets have revised what they think their growth number is going to be year over year. So maybe they were saying it was going to be 45%, and then they say 40%. And it's still growth, but then it gets misreported as, oh, it looks like EVs are losing momentum and stuff like that. And even then, I've already seen between like January, a similar thing. I'm trying to remember the outlet, but they said, oh, it's going to go down to 30%. And they had been previously saying it was going to be 40 to 50% growth. And now they're back up to like 40%. And I think there's just so much, just these kind of short-term blips that keep popping up in the news, whether it's some of the, I guess I could say, fear-mongering of winter charging and the experience that we're seeing uh, even in Chicago and a couple areas this past winter. And that just kind of gets all the noise. And then people try to put that in these models based on short-term data and really start throwing off these numbers. But I completely agree with you, Walter. When you start looking at it longer term and actually going to usually the actual news source and people doing these reports, the numbers are pretty convincing that what has started is just going to continue.
Worth remembering as well that these are numbers that are without some of the major players, right? So, Walter mentioned Toyota and their kind of lackluster approach to EVs. You've got, GM, which has only really been in with the Bolt EV, which obviously left, but, is coming back with a bunch of others that are at that affordable stage of the market. You've got Honda coming in with the Prologue. A lot of Stellantis brands, you could list off another
For
10,
sure.
5, 10 manufacturers that haven't really been in the game yet. So even just by introducing them and adding 10, 20, 30,000, units to the sales, then you start to rack up. Even if we just kind of sell the same number of the previous, the Tesla, or even a few less, then you start to get all these other manufacturers piling in, and the numbers are just going to go up and up by virtue of loyalists, people who treat the vehicle like an appliance because it's A to B, soccer run, groceries, that kind of thing. They just need something to get from, one place to another, and those models do the job for them. So while we as EV purists might say peak charging's awful, takes an hour to go from 0 to 50%, whatever it is, they don't care. They're probably not going to fast charge it. It's for the grocery run, it's for local duty, all these kind of things that we take for daily use just for granted. It's an EV does the job. So there's a big soft middle there to just pile into and sell vehicles to people who aren't one end or the other of the spectrum. They're just there waiting for it to be the right price, the right range, whatever it takes for their use case. They're not pro or anti EV. They just need it to be the right vehicle or the right manufacturer.
I think that's a great point too. And one of the things that I don't think's been fully appreciated, I think a lot of the conversation does kind of go around the early adopter mentality, but with exactly what you're saying, not only just more options from different brands, but more options at more price points.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of families that I've probably been interested or just haven't had EVs on their radar because it just hasn't been in their price point. But I think everyone thinks about the early adopter. And with so many people, really what is a big starting point is replacing the second car they have.
Mm-hmm.
If they can replace that second car with an around town EV and they start driving that, they kind of start to realize a lot of the perks and realize how useful that can be for their primary car. And so maybe when they go to replace that next time, and then that's where you kind of see that snowball effect and the growth. So I completely agree with you. I think having more people come to the space with more EVs is really just going to accelerate what we're already seeing. And the biggest thing has always just been like, once one person gets one on the block, then other people start saying like, okay, if Joe can do it, then maybe these things are practical. And once again, it's just like you have to have that daily exposure. And I would kind of be curious for both of you guys, what do you think? Is there a way that traditional auto OEMs could be doing a better job of getting that exposure? Because I really do think it is there is that element of just kind of, as they say, getting butts in seats. and doing test drives, and maybe not even a test drive, but almost a extended test drive where you have it for a few days to a week. Because I will say I did have I don't want to name any names, but I had a very subpar experience from a traditional OEM dealership recently. The salespeople were great, but the interest, clearly their own personal interest in EVs, let alone knowledge base of it, just made it clear that they wanted to sell the other version that wasn't an EV. And I'm kind of curious if there's been any exposure or experiences you guys have had that kind of help maybe counteract that, or things that you think auto OEM should be doing more to change that perception and buying experience for the average consumer.
I think the experience in general is twofold. It obviously it requires the salesperson and the dealership to have some interest in selling them in the first place. I mean, they may get an allocation, but if they're not charged, they're sitting around the back of the lot. Nobody knows how to get in the vehicle and show you the ins and outs of things like regenerative braking. The accelerator's gonna push you forward pretty quickly. That kind of the ins and outs of electric vehicles that need to be something that they start to at least put on the table, rather than immediately starting with the charging issues, the things that you can't do with it. So the dealership attitude is certainly something right from the off. And then I think there's some of the more forward-thinking OEMs are starting to experiment with rentals, short-term rentals at certain dealership, or shorter leases, low mileage leases for exactly that kind of user that you're talking about, the one with the second car who maybe doesn't need to worry about it for the long trips, that kind of thing. So it's a way of getting, as we always say at these ride and drive events, bums in seats, get them experiencing it in a very low risk, low kind of commitment way, so that they can get into the feeling of an EV, how easy it is potentially to plug in at home, to do their weekly mileage with a electric drivetrain, but still have the knowledge that they can get out of the lease if they want to. They just need to get over that hump initially of, will it work for me, as you say? And if you can start to give them options that are very short, low mileage, not too high cost, and affordable models that suit their needs, I think you're already halfway there.
Yeah, and I would like to add the advantage that we're facing in 2024 for what you're describing. And I'm kind of curious, Chase, where do you where did you have that experience? What part of the country?
A small city along I-5 on the West Coast. I'll leave it
On
at
the
that.
West Coast. Yes.
Yeah.
Very strange. You would have thought EV adoption would have been high enough there that the interest would have been different. I just perceived it differently out there.
It is definitely a smaller, very beautiful, more rural city, but I think it was, I don't want to say eye-opening or surprising, but it was really interesting to hear and see the actual sales experience and positioning of the EV. And I mean, they first just came out like, well, why would you get it? It can't tow anything. And I didn't really try to push back. I just wanted to see what they kind of came at me with and what they started saying. And it just was really interesting where they started with. And like when I even started to push back, they're just like, oh, why don't you just get the gas version? And I don't know. I'm still cautiously optimistic, but I do think that is a big challenge. Even if you're still seeing that from dealerships, I don't know if I know some of these OEMs are trying to make certain dealerships more EV focused, or EV partners, if you will, with their brand than others. And I'm not sure if this one was one, probably not, for multiple reasons. But even then, I would say the sales experience compared to some of the other experiences I've had in the past was overall positive. The person was nice. They weren't too pushy. But it was just clear that they had no interest in the EV side of stuff. And it was unfortunate to kind of be reminded of this. And it's kind of the first time I'd seen this in a while. Once again, maybe it is the outlier, but it just was one of those things that I think still a pretty big challenge. And if we're seeing this on the West Coast, and I think it's going to be just something nationally and I think obviously from a country standpoint, we're probably looking at like you look at Europe and abroad. I don't think it's nearly as big an issue, and I think some of that may be the truck culture and other things. But it was just really fascinating to me that they just had no interest in it pretty quickly, or like, yeah, it's a cool toy, and they were trying to reposition the conversation pretty quickly to a different product.
It is interesting. I went on a road trip into coal country, which is eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, and I did stop at a dealership because it's one of the few places that had a level 2 charger anywhere. There's like no
Oh,
chargers
interesting.
whatsoever, and so I tried to use it, but it was broken. I went in and I was talking to them, and it was obvious there was a palatable, light, please take your EV and go somewhere else
Yeah.
mentality. But that's coal country, which is a little bit different. I would have thought in the West Coast. But in 2024, one thing we have going for us is as a salesperson is walking a floor, knowing they've got the $7,500 tax credit in their pocket where they could show someone a sticker price, let them sit in the car, and then hit them with a 7,500 discount is a pretty powerful sales tool in the tool chest. And I would have think,
I'm
just
actually
for
going to push
pure
back on that
sales.
a little bit.
Wow.
I don't think it is. I think they look at it as, or at least this is my experience, and I've kind of wondered if this would be the case. They look at it as just one more hurdle to try and kind of have the conversation like, okay, now I have to talk about charging, now I have to talk about EV incentives if they qualify or if they do leasing or all this stuff. To me, it just became clear like this is just making the sales process more complicated, good or
I think
bad.
if you're
Which
that
I totally agree with what you're saying, Walter. It should be looked at as actually an advantage. But it was
If I
just
was a
really interesting
salesperson walking the
experience.
floor and I was, looking at the sticker, I'm like, all right, here's how the script is going to go. They'll sit down, they'll look at the sticker, they'll sit down, and then I'll say,
Yeah,
well, you get 7,005, and then go to paperwork. It'd be something that you have in the EV that you don't have in the other cars. But
I think it's worth contrasting as well with, there is not a small gorilla in the room with Tesla's method of delivery and looking at direct sales. Obviously, that's limited in some places. They are headquartered in Texas but can't even sell there directly, But there are more and more of these coming up with your Lucid, Rivian, Polestar. Even if you start to go to some of these spaces, I think you feel it's a different environment in which to consider an electric vehicle. And it's to some extent with the dealerships, you're at the mercy of exactly what you say, Chase. It's the individual in charge or the salesperson, who's managing the team interested in electric vehicles. If they are, you get some very, very good dealerships. There are some
yeah,
great places who have really tried to make initiatives with charging parks, cafes were next to the chargers that they serve during the day, EV only events, a lot of different initiatives that just fall under the bucket of marketing the vehicles. But if you find a dealership that is of the mindset they're being forced to sell these things, I think that's where it switches into exactly what you're talking about. The incentives just, another piece of paperwork to do. They have to
yeah.
explain a different form of fueling. It's more work than it's worth, but they've got the sword of Damocles hanging over them that is, if that starts to really get close, then they have direct sales, EV only makers, and a lot of other competitive threats that it would be better to start at least preparing for and figure out how to sell these things now before it's critical time. Otherwise, further down the line, it's going to be a long, big, hill to climb to get back to just even status quo.
For sure. And there definitely are some other charging topics I want to talk to you guys about. But just it kind of reminded me of this recent experience. And I was surprised by, I kind of figured it would come up, but I didn't expect it to come up so quickly. And with multiple salespeople, they were just like, they were all actually really nice. But they're just like, why would you waste your time with those things? Those are toys. And then they show the other trucks and all this other vehicles they have. And when I asked them about the discount, they're like, well, that one doesn't count and this one does. And it's so hard to keep track of which one qualifies for what, which I kind of also get, but isn't doing them any favors in moving EVs. And the thing I wanted to ask you, Steve, is because you have the Ioniq 5 right
Yep.
now.
Mhm.
You look at Hyundai and Kia, they are brands that were growing, but seem to have really taken a large spike in growth with their electric vehicle approach in product and sales. And so I kind of am curious with your experience, was it much more, they were more open to it because you really weren't competing against another vehicle that they offer? Whereas I think in my experience, they're like, well, we got the diesel version, we got the gas version, and that electric thing, who knows, whatever. And I feel like that almost was kind of causing some internal confusion and like combativeness against the models versus maybe I'd just be a little real quickly hear your experience if it was much more different or much different.
It would have been perhaps interesting if I was shopping the Kona because that has a direct,
Fair.
plug-in hybrid and a pure gas version. But shopping the Ioniq 5, I think Hyundai corporately and Kia as well have put a big push behind them to let the dealerships know that they want to sell these, and they've created products that are mostly unique. I haven't noticed any particularly positive dealership stories with Hyundai or Kia, to be honest. More so with Hyundai on the ownership boards, but they generally seem to be the weakest link of the sales process. But they haven't also had very many horror stories other than the initial markups and what you get with every EV pretty much when it's in limited supply. But I haven't seen the dealerships as either a big plus in trying to sell them or an impediment in trying to steer me away to anything else. No.
Yeah. And Walter, I know with your experience, was it mostly when you kind of ordered it, reserved it online, and then essentially took delivery of it at the dealership, or did you have more engagement with taking delivery of your car at the dealership?
None of those. No. Really, my wife and my household makes most of the purchasing decisions for large ticket items like that. And she wanted a Tesla Model 3. She got herself one, was driving it around for a while. And slowly I started to be like, well, what's this electric car thing like? We had the charger installed in the garage and she was enjoying it. It looked like a nice car. You hear about Teslas. It's like a sexy new toy, as you say. And, ooh, I want to try it, put on my Ray-Bans and go cruise around in the Tesla. Slowly though, I started to realize this thing don't break down. It has no oil changes,
Right.
and it's more reliable. We got a nice tax break. This was 2019. I forgot what the tax code was back then, but we got a nice tax break. And we had to change the tires once and fill it with windshield washer fluid, but that was about it. And after that, the next car we added, we put in a Volvo XC40 Recharge, which is kind of like a crossover SUV, I think is a way of describing it, a little mid-size SUV. And so we had the Model 3 and the Volvo XC40 Recharge, as well as a Hyundai Ioniq, not a Ioniq 5, just the hybrid Ioniq, which was what my son was using prior to going to college. We sold that, and we also got a Cadillac Lyriq trading in the Tesla Model 3. The Model 3 is kind of a low car. I don't know if anyone's been in it and driven it as a daily driver. It's kind of a low car. Me and my wife are both in our 50s, so we're like, eh. So when you sit in a Cadillac, it's a super comfortable cream puff. So
Yeah.
we traded in the 3 for a Lyriq and got a big tax discount. And it wasn't horribly expensive. It wasn't like a Tesla Model X, but it's in the same sort of class, I would say, as a Model X. Is kind of a luxury large SUV, not a 3-row SUV, but it's a large SUV. And again, no breakdowns. You don't do anything to them. It's like a dream come true. It's like the most reliable Mercedes from the 90s on steroids. That's just ridiculously reliable. You can charge it in your garage. I don't go to gas stations anymore. And really, that was what has been the evolution for me, the being utterly convinced that, not only is it beneficial personally, from a national standpoint, sourcing the fuel for the transportation from domestically produced energy is strategically in the best interest of the country. I think that's one of the reasons why China is so ferociously starting to adopt EVs and encouraging them, just because they could be energy independent.
It's interesting you mentioned that trip to coal country because if anything, the generating electricity from coal could actually, save some of these areas because you could actually have a coal-powered EV at that point. But that is a meme and a trope that is pretty much dying out as far as coal production goes now.
Yeah, my house is nuclear. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it just is what it is.
It's in the middle.
Yeah, being on the West Coast, we have a lot of hydro, and that has its own pros and cons. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. You talk about your trip through coal country because I drive through. I've done a lot of road trips through Wyoming, and it's kind of the same deal, where large coal mines and the actual coal facilities, and there's definitely I don't know. I was kind of surprised how they didn't really cast off EVs in my experience with meeting people there. I didn't go to any of the dealerships. Maybe that'd be different, but it definitely did seem to be kind of more of an openness and interest in it than I had been expecting. I think that's almost why I was so surprised of my recent dealership experience. Not being like negative per se, but not just being open to like, okay, this is a buyer that's interested in it. Why don't I just move forward and make this happen instead of trying to go down a different path? But with that, one of the let's change topics a little bit. And I guess go to the actual charging side of stuff. And I know it was really interesting on our last conversation talking with you guys about your experience with kind of DC fast charging on the East Coast versus kind of what being really in the center of Oregon, so kind of in a pretty rural area, just the evolution and the addition of public EV chargers. There was a large announcement. I know it seems like you've been following it pretty closely, Walter and Steve, about kind of Flying J and some of the stuff with GM and their, I believe EVgo kind of had like a partnership for rolling out. And it seems like they've kind of cut that back from everything I can see here in Oregon, unfortunately. But I'm just kind of curious if you guys have seen any new developments, or I know kind of the other big thing that happened a few months ago, or probably not even that long, a couple months ago, was the big kind of announcements from Tesla kind of pulling back on their charging team a bit. But kind of just curious to hear regionally what your experience has been lately, just because I had to use a public charger the other day, and it's a CPO charging provider that I consistently have been underwhelmed with, and fortunately I didn't need a charge, but I decided, you know what, this is a pretty heavily invested one. It's not. I actually have no problem saying it's EVCS, and it's essentially part of the West Coast Electric Highway program. So they put a bunch of them all up and down Oregon, California, and Washington. And it was a terrible experience. I'll leave it at that. But I'd just be curious. It seems like you guys have been seeing a lot more kind of development with the public fast chargers on the East Coast and kind of Midwest area, and just continued growth. And I don't know if it seems to be like it's coming east to west with some of these projects, but I'd just be curious to hear what experience you guys have been having with just your own personal charging, and then other maybe just stories of note in the space that I think we could share with our listeners.
Well, I think I have a lot of experience with Electrify America and some of the early programs, so EVgo and the CCS networks that proliferated. And Walter has definitely stepped in with a lot of coverage from the kind of ground zero of your, as you say, Pilot Flying J's, your Buc-ee's and Mercedes fast charging, Walmart getting into it. So I can set a stage perhaps for where we've come from and how it started. And I think Walter is just the king of weekly updates on all of these new networks that are expanding out of his area and into, yours, Chase, to an extent, certainly into mine. But going back to the initial kind of areas with Electrify America, which started up in my area, central Massachusetts, around 2018. They obviously carried the can in the last year or two for the poster child of public charging unreliability, not being able to get a charge, half of the site being down, that kind of thing. I think it was fair to an extent that you could certainly say a lot of their older equipment had problems. They've acknowledged that themselves, and the West Coast seems to have been a particular pain point. Growing out in the last year, 18 months maybe now, they've upgraded to their latest generation hardware with mostly BTC power and Signet stations, which are kind of visible via this black siding and cladding and then a diagonal top. But most notably, they only have one port. I've found personally, and having been kind of gravitate towards them because I have a free charging plan that ends in about 6 months' time with the Ionic 5 that kind of keeps me on Electrify America to an extent. They've been much better in the last, certainly since they ripped and replaced a lot of those locations. They've been, I really haven't had any problems. I can't remember the last time I could not charge with Electrify America. EVgo has been kind of hampered to an extent with these older sites. They've had the same issue of older hardware that they put in perhaps even before 2018, a lot of 50 kilowatt 100
Yeah.
kilowatts. So by today's standards, if you're looking at 200, 300 kilowatt charging, they are antiquated units that have been in the ground for almost a decade now. So a lot of those, they're having the same kind of thing, although not on such a nationwide scale as Electrify America. So they have improved as well. You've got a lot of the NEVI funding, which maybe we'll get onto as a national federally funded program, is using these combination EVgo and Pilot Flying J locations, which have 350 kilowatt hardware, pretty much rock solid as far as I've seen, maybe one outage in 6 to 9 months of the NEVI program being around. But essentially, those two players that kind of formed it, and actually are a viable nationwide network, perhaps, are probably the most, long-standing standard bearers, and they both seem to be getting their act together compared to maybe 2 years ago when everything was getting, negative headlines. But that kind of bleeds into the East Coast has certainly been positive for me. I do a lot of trips over to Ohio, so Midwest connecting Northeast has been always been fairly good for me. But Walter is seeing that kind of those new networks branch out of his area and can speak pretty authoritatively to what's coming and how far they've got so far.
Yeah, and I could kind of venture off, and I'm going to try to stay focused on the question that was asked. But the one that I've seen recently, like just today, was VW Dieselgate funds disbursement for state-run locations. There's a lot of blank spots in the map that are getting filled in, at least in the state of North Carolina, for that. Just recently, two new stations opened in kind of an underserved area, and so those funds are still getting dispersed. So there's Dieselgate funds getting dispersed. There's the large pool of NEVI funds getting ready to be dispersed.
And I'm sorry, not to cut you off. When you say Dieselgate funds, it's not necessarily that they're Electrify America sites, but they are
No, sir.
sites. Yeah, just to
It's
clarify for listeners.
state-operated
Yeah,
fund disbursements for local independent CPOs getting built, and lots of times those will be CPE 250s that have wrapping on them indicating that there was a joint partnership with the state or whatever, and
right.
those are very common in my area. And there's been additional building of those in underserved areas along alternative fuel corridors through the state of North Carolina as of late. So that's still going on. But really, the big shift is the C-store space, the convenience store space, where as a C-store operator, if you look to see that you could have a higher dwell time of your customers, and you could also have your fuel delivered near the theoretical speed of light and not have to have liquid form trucked into a store in tanks, it just makes business sense to sink a little more upfront cost into electric vehicle charging infrastructure and then let your customers decide if they're going to use them or not. And I think there's a lot of C-store operators experimenting with that concept. You mentioned Pilot Flying J, not slow down. I don't know. So you mentioned slow down. That's not what I'm seeing. In fact, I just saw another new site today. I'm up to 41 sites that are now under construction with 38 sites open. And their goal is 200 by the end of the year. And I'm starting to think they might make it. So if they finish what they have now on their plate, they'll be up to 80. And every
That's
day I
great.
turn around, there's additional sites getting spotted as under construction. So that's definitely in full swing. And it is, as you mentioned, is a joint partnership between General Motors, Pilot Flying J, which is a Berkshire Hathaway company, as well as EVgo. So it's a triple partnership. But really, it's the C stores, the Circle K's, the 7-Elevens, the Quick Trips, the BPs, the Shell stations, all those locations that are looking at advantageous customer dwell times and the ease of delivering the fuel to the vehicles, in my opinion, is the big sea change that I'm seeing. There's another one regional out here called Racetrack. Them as well are they just opened multiple locations throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and their build continues.
That's great to hear. I'm kind of curious where you go to for information, new locations specifically with it. Because the reason I bring up the ones in Oregon was just 2 weeks ago, I had looked on the map that had showed where there were potential ones and where there were going to be ones in Oregon. And now they're showing as all potential. And I understood that. And I've kind of checked even on a couple other places that it's maybe not happening or it's like still like it's being pushed out. And so I'm just kind of curious where you usually go to find kind of the confirmation, like, because I'm using the map that's based, I believe that was GM site. It could have been Pilots. And now they're
If it
showing them
was
as optional or like potential ones versus it was going to be mostly potential, like a few for sure, and now it's just showing like maybe.
Yeah, so if it was kind of dark gray with purple pin drops, that's the Pilot Flying J map, and that is updated reflecting ones that are expected to be in service by the end of 24, and the count is 200. Their goal is 500 in total. It's kind of on track. It depends on which map you look at. Some maps show
Okay.
like kind of like the proposed phase one, but the one map that I think you're referring to is the end of 2024 map off the Pilot Flying J website, and there's 200 in there. And as you say, it's proposed locations, so there's some variability in whether or not those are actually
That
going
would
to
make
occur.
sense that maybe it's moved back because they might not, they're still might move forward with them, just not in 2024. Because the one
Correct.
I'd seen
Yeah.
earlier in the year showed that there was going to be like 3, and now it's like proposed, and I'd love to see more. So that's good.
Well, they're definitely coming. As I say,
Yeah.
I got 41 that I'm currently tracking under construction, and every day there's new ones popping up. So they're spending cash.
Are there any states or kind of hubs or areas that you're seeing them take off more than others, or are you seeing kind of it? Like I said, when I looked at the map last, it looked like it was almost going east to west, and I'm just kind of curious. There might have been like some in like Southern California, a couple like in Seattle.
I
But
can
I'm just
say
kind of
that
curious if you're seeing pockets or certain states where they're really being built first.
there's a little bit of tea leaf reading, but from what I'm gathering, they seem to be watching who is announcing NEVI funds. And
Yeah,
when a state announces, they either pause to receive the NEVI funds, or if they weren't awarded any, they proceed with their private build.
gotcha.
So they're kind of like waiting, staggering up, waiting for those NEVI funds to be released. And in the state of Ohio, had many round one awards, and they're built. They are
Yeah,
under construction and almost done. So basically, they seem to be tracking NEVI announcements.
that's great. Yeah, I know you had kind of some thoughts you wanted to share on the NEVI funding side of stuff, Steve, and just seeing how that's been rolled out. I know on LinkedIn I've seen a couple of your posts around, both good and bad, with your thoughts on that. So I think that'd be great to share here.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anybody wants the actual numbers and who's awarded what and which states are leading or which CPOs are leading, Lauren McDonald at EV Adoption is the place to go. He's got the policy side down and who's winning what. So there's always good rankings coming from that. I think most notably is kind of as Walter pointed out. I've focused on the construction side and then the reliability of stations which are in the ground, which is easy at the moment because there are only 8 of them, so pretty easy to track. But as Walter kind of hinted there, there's I think Pilot Flying J and EVgo in that partnership won about 2022, something like that, stations in the round one funding, and about half of those now are, one of them is open, but about another 10 are about to come online. So we're really going to start to get this tsunami of activations in the states that led the way with awards. But that's kind of the next wave of activations, because you're seeing, as Walter mentioned, a lot of chains like the Loves, the Travel Centers of America. I lose track of the number of names, but a lot of these are applying, and that because they're supposed to be travel networks and they're supposed to be within 1 mile of an interstate, you really winnow down pretty quickly what's within that 1 mile of an interstate exit. Right? There's travel, or truck stops, travel centers, maybe service plazas, and the occasional mom and pop store. But for the most part, this is these big national chains that are starting to open these things. So we're seeing a lot of the activations happen here in the Northeast, which has helped me keep track of it. I was able to go up to the first Tesla federally funded site in Maine, which is in a really strange little area, kind of not really near an interstate, but off on the way to Acadia National Park. So you're seeing some kind of leading tech almost, because it's the first Tesla V4 Post that has a touchscreen on it, first that you can activate with a card, whereas previously you'd have just plug in and, because that's Tesla's closed ecosystem, working in lockstep. But now they've got all these new requirements. So you're starting to see the money flow to your Teslas, your Pilot Flying J's, and one of the biggest names that I don't really have a lot of kind of experience with, because they're a Midwest kind of Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, that kind of area provider, is Francis Energy, who I think just became the leading number of awards. At least certainly they won the most funding from the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure funding. And that's going to be really interesting, because I don't hear great things about them, to be honest. Our viewers on the Coast to Coast EVs podcast have, again, maybe it's using old equipment, old kind of dated references, but they have a lot of skin in the game for this NEVI funding, and they are now kind of leading even beyond Tesla. And you kind of hinted at the layoffs at Tesla. If they're going to take up the mantle, they're going to have a lot of pressure on their shoulders to really deliver for the number of sites and the amount of money that they're taking in.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good thing you brought up. Actually, there's quite a few different things you brought up. I think that's interesting around, you said the Tesla one's kind of near a national park, correct? Or
Yeah, they're supposed to be, these initial rounds are on alternative fuel corridors. So there's,
Yeah.
every state has a certain amount of designated mileage on these corridors. And one of them for Maine, aside from the big I-95 route up to Canada, is, I think it's Route 1 along the coast, kind of coastal Maine from the Portland area and then across to Acadia National Park. So big tourist route. There's a lot of cute little coastal Maine towns, lighthouses, all the stuff you associate with a good Maine trip. But this is a nice little town, kind of a harbour town, and Tesla just, for whatever reason, that was the first site they managed to get in the ground and was activated, I think, in April. But it's interesting that has kind of pushed them to develop a new piece of the puzzle, right? Because they now need to, in all the other things that we could talk about with public access for superchargers, this is something that has been, to receive those federal funds, they had to have different kind of payment reader, the ability to display the cost per charge and have basic charging information displayed that would normally be pushed to the Tesla because that's all designed in-house. So it's starting to force even Tesla to make that transition to as much of a public charging provider as they wish to be.
No, and I think that's definitely that could be unto itself its own podcast, just kind of like the app experience versus. I mean, that was kind of what I reiterated. I think tweeted or whatever you call it now on Twitter, X, whatever. The other day after I had my bad experience, I was like, for EVs to really take off, it's got to be just as easy as filling up with gas, if not easier from a payment standpoint. And I had to download 2 apps, put my credit card in 3 times. Apple Pay doesn't work, even though it has an Apple Pay option. And just like, I cannot think of literally just such a bad experience. And so I think that's great to see. Like, you just need sometimes, if you want to take it to the next level with kind of an app augmentation or kind of a software layer, great. But I think all these different technologies that take off, they just have to work. And the simplicity around just having a payment terminal and ideally in a good world, it'd have like a plug and charge sort of situation where it's even simpler than gas. You just plug in and walk away. Don't even think about it.
Yeah, I think that makes the charging process, when you talk about it futzing around and spending 3 or 4 minutes to get it working, if you can just do that, plug and charge, and that becomes the standard, then it does take an advantage over gas. You're not doing the card reader potential for skimming your data, all that kind of stuff. It cuts out. And as long as it works, you can do exactly what Tesla owners do, walk away to the store, passive kind of activity, right? The car charges whilst you do your stuff, and then it starts to become a additive bonus, because when you're fueling, you're just fueling, right? You've got to stand there, you've got to hold the pump, you've got to, unless someone's there to do it for you, like New Jersey or a few of those handful of states. But for the most part, you can go and do your other stuff while you're charging, come back to the charge car and be on your way again.
No, I mean, it saves. It seems simple, but it saves so much time on a road trip. If you're doing like back-to-back ones, just do plug it in, walk away, go use the bathroom, get back in the car, and go again. Yep. But yeah, that not to. I mean, I get it. The experience I had is rare, but it's just like, this is so unacceptable in 2024. Where it had a card reader, and the card reader doesn't even work, and I had to even find out like through just double checking PlugShare that was like, coming soon, payment terminal functionality. And that was, I believe, from the CPO back in like early 2023. And clearly it just never came, even though it has the terminal right there. And so I think just hearing all these stories.
Bring up EVCS with Eric, because I'm sure he's got war stories from them as well.
I look forward to it, and I want to commiserate with them, because it's unfortunate, because they've got so many great sites that were funded by the state of Oregon to upgrade. And it, in my experience so far, has been a missed opportunity. But going back to kind of the rollout of the larger sites, I mean, what are you guys seeing as far as kind of like the ideal layout? I realize we're kind of coming up short on time here. So I just wanted to kind of figure out, just on the last thing on the NEVI funding, like, do you want to see Because I think so many of these like early public fast charging installations, they might only be like 4 or maybe even up to 6. And it really does seem like to make this model work, and you're starting to even see it at Buc-ee's and these other ones where they are doing also the very large charging stall locations and stuff like that. And I'd just be curious to kind of hear what your guys' thoughts on are, like what the ideal, if we're going to give the NEVI funding to these locations, like what should be the ideal minimum size, like minimum power. I know it's stated, but like it's just been interesting to me what has been chosen versus what I think is kind of the more ideal and future-proofed solution for these sites.
I can go first. I think there's two school of thoughts, and I might just be speculating, but I think there's two school of thoughts. One is the longevity of the host and their viability long-term economically, whether or not they're going to be closing. So you want to gravitate more towards like community colleges or government institutions that will be around for a very long time, but that might not be in convenient locations, or expediency, which are the convenience stores immediately off the interstates. Those are kind of the two main areas that I seem to be focus on. And my personal opinion is the C stores right off the interstate, the real estate's pretty good. And as long as it doesn't get overly expensive for taxes, the charging stations themselves will help sustain the business model of the C store. So in my opinion, those are the nicest, where you don't have to walk a long way to an anchor mall in order to go to a food court. It's just, 10 steps away, where you go inside and you have the facilities, you can get yourself a Slurpee or whatever you want. So my personal opinion is the C stores immediately off the interstates for road trips. Similarly, inside urban areas or for people in multi-tenant dwellings, C stores or grocery stores.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing with NEVI is just the minimum being complied, to get the money. Because that's what Walter kind of pointed out. They are looking, a lot of these players are looking to get a foot in the water. They're not trying to build out a massive charging hub as Tesla has had to do at some locations because they have the sheer volume and demand for it. They're just trying to add on those 4 ports, which are the requirement, the minimum 150 kilowatts, although a lot of them do go higher in various configurations, and get those in the ground. So they start to gather data, they get some federal funding for it, they start to offset some of those early, very high capex costs that come with installing EV infrastructure, and just build from there. But I think in terms of the ideal charging station, Walter kind of hit on it in that you really need to match it to the dwell time of the location. If I have a gas station which already has a canopy and a lot of the creature comforts of a road trip, like your squeegees, your trash cans, stuff that we take for granted as travelers, you have to have those for the electric vehicle traveler as well. You need those as part of the makeup. It's a bizarre thing to have some big piece of construction and then kind of forego some of the basic amenities. When you get to a town center and some of those other locations, if things are walkable, then maybe a lower power is fine. Maybe you just need a bunch of lower power equipment that you can install, and that may be a benefit for the town and the kind of people and businesses that are looking to benefit from these this investment, because then people do walk around the town, start to frequent the local businesses and use the facilities that are around them. So I think it varies from place to place. Some places you may want the kind of Electrify America charging hub that you have in downtown San Francisco with lounges and facilities and 20 chargers. In places like the middle of Wyoming where you're being chased, I doubt you would want. I mean, you may want one, but probably not going to get one anytime soon.
No, and I think what Walter says is pretty spot on. You want something that has the right facility or the right amenities, but at the same time, that is kind of where, like you're saying, a 250, 350, like something higher power. So it's like 15 minutes, usually kind of bathroom break, get a water, whatever, and you've got enough charge to kind of get on your way for another couple hours. Whereas like 150, even though it's still a decent amount of power, it can actually start having like a pretty big delta in how much time you might be sitting there to charge. And then it becomes kind of a different thing if you're at a mall or a city center, like you're saying, where it's like, okay, it's lower power, but I can go do something a bit more than hang out at a gas station or a convenience store. But what were you going to say, Walter?
Yeah, I was going to say another thing I'm hearing with some frequency is the safety issue, and lighting and having a staff member at a convenience store is beneficial, because being alone in a mall parking lot at night is not something that is conducive to feeling safe for other EV drivers. Myself, I'm kind of the scary person, so I don't worry about that. But other people apparently are. I'm hearing that more and more, that the convenience stores generally are sought after because there's a staff member on site, and the safety issue and the lighting and everything.
No, I think that's a great call. And like kind of the EV alternative we've seen is like what Steve was talking about, like the Electrify America uh, one in San Francisco, where it is gated off. There's other stuff there. And so it is more secure, but and you see actually more of these in Europe. And I think kind of like the Mercedes Benz one they did domestically, but obviously then the expenditures of that and that investment goes way up. And so I think you're totally right that there's a pretty good overlap. There's already so much of the infrastructure and kind of safety elements built in with the traditional C stores that it just makes sense to have more EV chargers there. And I realize we're kind of coming up on our time here, and I want to be respectful. I know, Steve, you wanted to kind of talk a little bit about intercity charging, so maybe we can just talk about that for like the last couple minutes and kind of share some of your thoughts on what your experience with that has been before we sign off here.
Sure, you might be jumping into another podcast though. With
I know, yeah. Maybe let's maybe start with that and think of it as more of a teaser for the next episode.
I guess.
But I just want to make sure we cover it with the time.
Yeah, well, I know I visited the Gravity Charging Hub, which is one of the big kind of headline 500 kilowatts for whatever the technology behind that is. That's still open to debate. But, the idea of having 20, 30 chargers in the center of downtown Manhattan that can, fill a car in 15, 20 minutes is an interesting one and caught a lot of headlines. But I've found myself thinking more and more, we spoke to the co-founder of It's Electric, one of the curbside charging solutions, which is purely level 2. And there's a lot of these, Volt Post in New York City. You have Flow installing, very high utilization curbside charging. And to me, the experience was fine at the Gravity Center, but that was a dedicated activity I had to do. I mean, I filmed the video, but I went there to do that and to check it out. But I wasn't able to go and take advantage of any of the things in Midtown Manhattan because I needed to be back to my car because it was fast. Whereas if I'd have been able to plug in, on a level 2, you're kind of 7, 8 kilowatts, it charges perfectly reasonably. I'm probably going to enjoy downtown Manhattan for 4, 5, 6 hours. And then I'm going to go on my way with much the same amount of energy as I left with the dedicated fast charging stop. And probably install a lot more of those curbside chargers for the money that it costs to build a charging hub. So I think there's value in having both. Obviously, as a rideshare driver or maybe a commercial fleet driver, you need to have that quick charging stop. Time is money, and you need to be on your way. But as a visitor and maybe a local business, I'm just thinking more and more that we can't or really shouldn't overlook that level 2 charging. It's a valuable piece of the puzzle that those solutions that I mentioned are going to be a big part of, I think.
Yeah, I can agree more. And I think there's a lot of really interesting level 2 DC charging options that are kind of starting to hit the market now that are kind of the right balance and actually bring down costs even further, especially if you are like a parking garage or a large building where you actually probably have easier access to DC. And you can kind of tap into that and then have a large scale facility and have more DC. It's not going to be 350 kilowatts, but even if it's anywhere from like 10 to 20, that's still like plenty and makes it a lot more scalable and easier for those kinds of experiences. Because, I think you're totally right with the investment and also just like being able to be more efficient with the time of leveraging level 2 charging when you are in a place like Manhattan or somewhere else. And it's not that you need a fast charge, you just need a consistent charge reliably.
And
going to the
headlines, though.
Exactly. And I think that's also, I think we talked about this on our previous episode too, where it's like the importance of having commercial specific charging only. If you're going to be an Uber, you're going to be someone, there needs to be an option that kind of makes it so that's where they go instead of always having to go to the public chargers. And then maybe people who are on their trips taking up a stall and running into issues like we saw this past winter. I do realize we're kind of up for time, and I just want to say thank you both. I know, Walter, we've gone over. So Walter, Steve, thank you so much. We'll have to have you guys on again soon, and really enjoyed this conversation today.
Yeah, same. Thanks, Chase.
Have a great day.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Grid Connections podcast. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Steve Birkett, founder of Plug and Play EV, and Walter Schulze, the host of the Network Architect channel. I also recommend checking out their live episodes they stream every other week, recapping highlights of the EV space. You can find links to their YouTube channels and more in today's show notes. If you found this episode informative and enjoyable, please share it with at least one other person who might appreciate it as well. Your support in spreading the word means a lot to us. And don't forget to leave a positive review on our podcast page. It really helps us continue bringing you quality content. Until next week, this is the Grid Connections podcast, signing off.